My name is Judy Brown. I'm one of the board members, the directors of IFWA, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation this evening. It'll be very interesting and also very useful, as I know across the state we do have a lot of deer that like to nibble on our oak trees. So this will be a very interesting presentation this evening. I wanted to share some of the things that I or I enjoy about being an IFWA member. It's a great way to meet fellow woodland landowners across the state of Indiana. And there's some benefits to being a member, such as this type of presentation. The annual conference or the annual meeting that we have in November is always very top notch with great presenters and an opportunity to network with our fellow landowners. There's other benefits such as the Foresters Directory and many great workshops throughout the year. So if you're not a member, I encourage you to join. And if you are a member, I'd like to say thank you for being a member. And without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Liz.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Liz Jackson. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Forestry and Woodland Owners Association. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. It's such a nice evening out. It means a lot to us that you have joined us, and I know there's many other things you could be doing with your time, so we appreciate it. We are going to be recording this, so should you know people who didn't get a chance to see it, we will message when it's available. I'd like to remind you to keep your video off during the presentation because that'll limit distractions, but you're welcome to turn it back on during the Q&A. And if you have any questions at any time, please put those in the chat. I'll moderate those at the end of the program. We're pleased to have joining us tonight Joe Caudell. He's the State Deer Project Leader for the Indiana DNR Division of Fish and Wildlife. Joe earned his MS and his PhD in wildlife biology from Utah State University. And then he started his career with USDA APHIS before coming to the Indiana DNR. He's currently an adjunct instructor at IU on wildlife policy and has taught at Purdue and Murray State, along with his duties at the DNR. Joe, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, let me see if I can get my screen up. Let's see if I can get this thing turned on. Have you got my screen there, Liz?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
It sounds good too.
Perfect. Start from the beginning. That's the place we always want to start. Can you see that first slide there, that title slide?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all about this topic. This is something that we have been working on for a while and working on it with the folks at Purdue. And it was really what we were trying to do was understand our deer populations, the impacts that they can have on the ecology of our forest and our landscapes, and then also to try to understand public opinions towards deer. And so we did this in a layered fashion where we were collecting this data in the same places at the same time. So while we were out, and I say we, it's the royal we. This is, you know, really the work of several of our, well, I guess relatively newly minted PhD students at Purdue, but it was done in a layered fashion so that we were collecting population data at the same time we were collecting this data on our forest, and at the same time we're collecting you know, what the public thinks. And so by using this approach, we actually found out a lot of valuable information. And so mostly what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is some of the new population data that we have and how we're going to work to get that data statewide. And then this is data that's going to be publicly available so that folks can use it for a variety of different reasons. Okay. So, you know, the first thing, you know, the reason why we need some sort of a technique to estimate deer population density, and, you know, we can't go out and just count deer. You can't count. I mean, you can count deer in a few places, but you can't count them everywhere. And so we count them in certain places, and then we basically relate that to other habitat variables. And the idea is that, you know, deer respond to these variables about the same way in different places. And so, you know, if you count enough places and you have a good enough model, you can actually predict deer density to a fairly high degree of certainty. And this is a prediction, it's a model. Okay. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And what you're seeing over here on the right, if you're not familiar with it, is the National Land Cover data set. And this is basically 30 meters by 30 meters. I typically think of it as a quarter acre by quarter acre or a quarter acre in, you know, view of land use. Okay. And this is pretty important because this is kind of underlying this prediction. And so this was the work of Zach Delisle, and he was basically trying to come up with a spatially explicit model for predicting deer density. And the spatially explicit part of this is basically saying, you know, looking at the very specific area where the deer are and the relationship of those areas to things that are going on around it. So that might be the cover, the amount of openings, you know, a whole variety of different factors that might be related to deer density. And so the first thing he had to do was kind of figure out which of these factors were most important. Okay. Now, initially, this data set that we're going to be talking about was actually developed through the use of trail cameras. Okay. And then later on, I'm going to talk about how we're going to use this operationally, but we're going to be using planes and drones because of the cost effectiveness of it. But essentially, Zach put this quarter acre or 30 meter grid system all over the entire state. And they were working in 3 general areas. And in those areas, he had test landscapes selected. And in these test landscapes, he had over 1,000 cameras out looking at what was going on in the ground. Okay. And this is this work was done in the wintertime. And so these are estimates, when we talk about them, are after the harvest. So these are post-hunt estimates. And so, you know, basically what you're doing is you're putting these cameras out and you are counting deer and at each of these locations, and you're estimating the deer density in those locations. And then, like I was talking about earlier, basically Zach started modeling this relationship between what he was seeing in these cameras and the size of the deer density in those areas that he was estimating with a variety of variables. Okay, so for instance, in this particular graph, what we're looking at is the relationship of deer density with fragmentation. Okay, and so if you have very little fragmentation, so if you picture a completely enclosed older forest, you actually have relatively low deer densities. And then as that fragmentation increases, you actually start getting more deer because deer are an edge species. And so they like a variety of plants on the ground. And so that fragmentation, as it increases to a point, you get more deer, and then it drops back down, and then it goes back up. And as you're getting more and more fragmentation, you can get a greater deer density. And then at a certain point, you get too much fragmentation, and that density starts dropping off again. Okay, so this isn't a linear or a straight line relationship where if you have low fragmentation, you have few deer, and if you have high fragmentation, you have many deer. Okay, it's a very complex relationship. And the same thing is true for these other factors over here. And these factors are the ones that Zach basically figured out were the ones that could predict deer density the best. Okay. And so, for instance, wetlands he found were very important to deer. Okay. So if you have a short distance to wetlands, so this is like where basically the deer were standing and how far it is to that wetland. So if there's a short distance to wetland, you typically have more deer. As it starts getting further and further away from wetlands, it goes down, and then there's a point where it goes back up again. And then as you start getting further and further away from wetlands, it goes back down. The deer density goes back down. The area of wetland habitat in the surrounding area. So this might be, if you're looking at this quarter acre and you look around and there's lots of other these little quarter acre squares that have wetland habitat in those. Basically, as that wetland habitat is going up, your deer density starts to go up. Okay. But you can see again, that relationship isn't just a straight line. It kind of goes up a little bit. And then towards the end here, where you get lots and lots of wetlands, it starts really going up. Okay. Another one is the road length in the surrounding areas. And if you stop and think about it, if you have roads going through a forest, that's creating these openings that deer like. It's creating edge. And so again, when you have a small amount of road length, or if you think about total road area, you have few deer. And then over as you get into more and more total road length, that relationship starts going up. You start potentially getting more and more deer in those areas. And then the last one is the area of concealment. So how much area is it for them to basically hide and live? And so if you have a small amount of that, you typically have low populations. Kind of in this mid-range is where it's highest, but then it really drops off if you have, too much concealment. And I typically equate that to, super thick, that could be brush or plants or whatever, that the deer really just can't even move through. Okay. So if you start thinking about all of these relationships together, and then you start thinking about these little quarter acre squares that he is estimating deer in, if you were to see one that had each of these characteristics, so it had some of the high, like it had this good relationship with fragmentation where the deer density was high and the distance to wetland was this kind of this intermediate range, and you had a lot of wetland in the surrounding area and a good amount of total road length and kind of this middling amount of concealment, you can expect to have a lot of deer. Okay. On the other hand, if you are kind of in this range where you've got lower fragmentation, a long distance to wetland, a small amount of wetland around that area, a small amount of roads, and very little concealment, conceptually, you're going to have very few deer. If you think about it, this might be even what a hunter does when they go out looking for a place to hunt. They're looking around at the area. If they know about deer, and they haven't done this type of research, but in their mind, they're looking at different things that they know will either attract deer, or they typically find deer there. A lot of times hunters will set up on the edge of the woods and maybe a cornfield because they know deer use that resource. And so that's essentially what this model is doing. Now, when you get into these very complex relationships where maybe you have something that would indicate a high deer density because of the fragmentation, but something that would indicate a much lower deer density due to the total road length, well, that's when you've really got to get into modeling and statistics to predict what's going to happen in that cell. And so, Zach had the cells that he had measured all of this in. And so then his model predicted it out to the rest of the areas where he didn't have that same data. Okay. And so essentially what it gave us in the end, this end product, was this map of relative abundance and density, and also, essentially the relative location to each other, where you have like high densities and areas where you have low densities. And so that's what we're going to really dig into here in just a bit. And if you're interested, this is the research article that where they actually developed this method for deer in Indiana and talk about it in a lot more detail. So if you are interested in the science behind it and a more detailed explanation, this is the paper that you want to look for and go to and read. Okay. So then the next thing that we had to think about as an agency, so, Zach had created this and we had to start thinking about it. Now, replicating this on a statewide basis using camera traps would be very expensive. And actually part of Zach's dissertation was to look at the cost effectiveness of these various techniques. And the camera traps are one that he looked at. And the other one was using crewed aircraft. So flying around and recording this data rather than using trail cameras. And that wound up being the most cost-effective technique, primarily because of the speed and the amount of basically people you need to do this. And so, you need your pilot and somebody to run the camera, but that's pretty much it. And then somebody to look at the data when you get back. And so this wound up being the technique that we are going to be using as a state going forward. And so, basically we're going to be doing conceptually very much the same thing that Zach did. So we actually have another PhD student working at Purdue to change over this model from the camera trap model to something that will work with our aerial data collection. And this is going to be done with a combination of crewed aircraft because they can cover a vast area very quickly, and drones or UAVs. And these are going to be applied really as necessary. And I'll kind of explain this in just a second. So essentially what we're going to be doing all over Indiana are setting up these flight transects that the plane is going to be using. And again, these are primarily done in the wintertime. The leaves need to be off the trees in this case. And so we're looking at probably something that's towards the end of hunting season, but definitely after like the firearm season. So, December through, pretty much now when things start greening back up. Okay. And so this will be occurring over both private and public land. Additionally, what we're doing, because our public lands get a much more intensive amount of hunting, we want to make sure that we've got good estimates there. So we're going to be doing additional flights over public land to really tighten up that estimate even more. Additionally, there are times when we need more data from specific areas. So, if you look at this area, these are random locations, but we might get an EHD outbreak, or like in this area that we're going to be looking at again in southern Indiana, they have a very, very low deer density. And just to make sure that that number is accurate, that density is accurate, we can fly additional flights in those areas. And so these areas where they're like EHD outbreaks and over our public lands or areas of very high or low deer density, these are the areas we're primarily thinking we'll use the drones in, simply because we can target those areas a little bit easier, go and send a biologist out, fly these routes, and then bring the data back. And the good thing is the data is comparable. And so what does this look like? So this right here is, so as the plane is flying, it's collecting paired footage, one in, which is over here on the left-hand side, is infrared. And then over on the right-hand side, this is just regular video camera, red, green, blue, RGB video camera. And so it's collecting those at the same time that it's flying. And so here's just a little bit of clip from Zach's test that he was doing when he was out working. And you can see here, those little white blobs are deer. And then you can confirm it over here on the RGB. With this technique, the nice thing is the biologists can download this, bring it back to the office, and you can have one or two people or multiple people actually go through this data and look at it. And you can pause it just like I've done here. You can slow it down. And what that does is it allows your count to be a little bit more accurate because, or a little bit more precise, because you can look at this and be like, oh yeah, look, there are 2 deer over there. I wasn't 100% certain about this, but now that I stop and I look at it, and you can look at the shape of the blobs versus the way these flights have been done historically is the biologist, and it has to be a highly trained biologist. It usually has to be a pair of biologists so they can each look out one side of the window. And as they're flying along, they are looking at deer and they're trying to count deer. At the same time, they're also trying to count or estimate how far away from the plane the deer is standing, because that affects your ability to actually see the deer. So you're trying to collect these 2 things while the plane's bouncing up and down, and you're trying to count, and you look and maybe you're like, oh, was that a deer? And the plane just keeps going. The plane can't hit pause and stop in the air to look around. Whereas with this technique, at least you can pause it. You're also looking straight down, and so you don't have to do these corrections. You just, right, here's the deer. The other nice thing about this is it's at the same time it's collecting GPS coordinates. So you can do a little bit of trigonometry and figure out on the earth where that deer is standing by calculating the lat and long. And you can do that for each one of the deer. And then if you think back to our 1/4 acre grid, now you can place that deer on that NLCD map and understand kind of the relationship of the habitat and everything that's going on. So there's a lot of advantages to using this technique as opposed to, these live flights where the biologist is trying to look out the window and count. And so, but once you get the deer placed, and now we know, like in this example, and this is just one I threw up there, this one would have 3 deer in it. And then you start looking at all of those habitat variables and those relationships that we were talking about, which is the number of deer in this cell. You start looking at the total road length in the surrounding area, the amount of wetlands in the surrounding area, the amount of fragmentation. If you think back to our graph, there's a good bit of fragmentation here. And so, you can think of it probably on that more upper end. The amount of cover, it's on a little bit lower end, but remember that middling area is where you got most of your deer. And then you look at your distance to wetlands. And the PhD student who will be working on this will also be, checking out other variables and making sure this relationship holds up with these flights. But again, the idea is once you have these estimates in these test grids, you can then apply that to the other grids to produce a much better estimate of abundance. Okay, so then again, we're getting back to this idea of knowing what our deer density is relative to each place on the landscape, and then even having an idea of what it is for management or for various purposes. But again, just like the other methodology, if you are really interested to see, basically how these flights work and even the equipment and all the testing that was done, you can look up this paper here and read all about it. So then the question is, what can we learn from this new data set? What can we do with this once we have it developed? Well, first of all, from a deer management standpoint, having population data opens up a whole variety of different tools that we now have access to. For instance, issuing deer damage permits, we can have a much better idea of the impact in the area with this. We can look at things like the proportion of deer that are being harvested. We can, it helps us set our understand the impact of our quotas better. And so from that aspect, there's a lot that we can do with this. From even like hunters and landowners understanding what the relative deer density is. And so if you look again here, I'm just going to point this out so you remember, the yellow areas are a high deer density. And this could be anything 40 deer per square mile or more. And these little blocks that you're looking at here, these are actual square miles. This is just a grid that was overlaid the state that's a square mile, just to give an idea of deer density in that area. The darker the color is a lower deer density. And so these can get down to like, 2, 3, 4, 5 deer per square mile. Okay. So again, just to give you an idea. And so you can see that, first of all, deer aren't distributed evenly across the landscape. Okay. And I think this is something that, everybody knows intuitively, but, once you start looking at it and thinking about it in relation to, what's going on in the ground, these really interesting patterns, typically open up. And so, this is one that I found particularly interesting. And so this is an area down in Harrison County that had very few deer. Okay. And over here's another one of those areas. And typically we think of southern Indiana as having lots of deer, but you can see here, we go from very, very few deer to, almost our lowest category here to our highest category in essentially a mile. Okay. So deer densities change rapidly across the landscape. Okay. And so if you start thinking about this area, and it's like, well, why is it like that? Now, if you know about this area and you're familiar with it, you may even know this area, and it's like, okay, well, let's look at our NLCD data set again, and we're looking at our various categories over here. We've got a little bit of evergreen forest, some mixed forest, some deciduous forest. But again, relatively speaking, very few roads, very few openings, very dense. This is one of our areas that we have, good, bat populations, these tree roosting bats. And the reason is because it's a very dense forest. And again, thinking about to our model, this would be expected because, this is an area that's going to be favored by deer. And this is actually one of our state forest here. Same thing over here in the national forest. There are areas that have very low deer densities, but again, areas that have very high deer densities. Okay, so and all these little green blotches here, this is just an overlay of public land on top of this map, just so you can get an idea. And again, this over here on the left-hand side is going to be primarily national forest. And then again, this right here is one of our state forests. There's also, I can't think of the name of it, but one of our state parks in here as well, but relatively low deer density. Okay. So variable density across the land, but it can change very quickly. So does a higher deer density automatically equate to greater amounts of damage from browsing to the understory? And so I called the researcher, Richard Sample, who had worked on this, and I asked him this question, and basically it was no. That's just not an automatic response of having more deer. And so we talked a little bit more about this, and and here's an example again from Indiana. And so this is up in eastern Indiana. And so you've got Steuben County, LaGrange, Noble, and DeKalb here. Okay. And this area of the state is characterized in general by very high deer densities. So these are actually much greater than 40 deer per square mile. Okay. So we just kind of cut those colors off at that point. But when I was talking to him about this, in general, this 4-county area is characterized by having older average twig age. So that means twigs are on the ground and they're surviving. They're not getting eaten. And relatively high diversity. And this is an area where when he was out working, he was seeing a variety of small herbaceous plants underneath or in that understory. And so, traditional thinking would tell us that with such high deer densities in some of these areas, this place should be almost denuded of any growth underneath these trees. But there are even highly preferred deer foods in these areas. So it's more of that, damage to forage understory is really characterized by the unique characteristics of that woodlot and surrounding areas. And so, this really varies. So if you're familiar with this part of the state, this is Franklin County, and this is Brookville Reservoir here. And typically, when I think about this with deer management, because I've worked over here a lot, we've had bovine tuberculosis in this area, and we've also had some significant EHD outbreaks, or epizootic hemorrhagic disease outbreaks there. And typically, this side of the lake is characterized by very dense deer populations. And on this side of the lake, it's mainly cultivated crops and hay and pastures, and has very relatively small deer populations. But if you start thinking about those characteristics of the woodlot, you've got to think about things like what other cover is in the area. So again, thinking about, this list right here, what is all around that woodlot? What's the proximity to other types of cover? What about the amount of hunting pressure in the area? You can get a lot of hunting pressure over here on this side of the lake, on the left-hand side or the western side of the lake. But because hunters generally know there are fewer deer over here on the eastern side, you might have a lot less hunting pressure. Okay. The size of the woodlot, that's going to make a big difference. So somebody over here again on the western side of the lake compared to the eastern side, these woodlots are much smaller. Okay. The type of crops that are being planted nearby. So what else are the deer eating? What about when like our crops are off? What other things are present? So are there cover crops? Another thing from RD's work is the amount of nearby development, because he saw in the wintertime that it seemed like deer would go and eat other things. So they would leave those woodlots and be eating in basically the vegetation out of people's backyards. And so browsing on those sorts of things. And so when you start thinking about this and looking at it and thinking about it again, kind of in our square mile, and a lot of times the reason we can use a square mile is because that's about the home range of a buck in these types of areas. A doe has a little bit smaller, more like a 3/4 of a mile to a half a mile. And so, if you've got a group of deer that are, using these woodlots, you may have a different problem or amount of damage compared to what's going on over here or what's going on over here. And so the point is, it's not a uniform problem across the state or even within a county. Okay, these problems can be unique to the situation. And so it could even be that this person right here with this much smaller woodlot maybe having significant damage, or there's really no understory in here, compared to maybe even this one up here that's much closer to different things that are going on, different types of forage it may be there at different times of the year. And so just keep in mind that a lot of times these are going to be localized problems, and this isn't just something that's uniform across the landscape. So now that we've kind of looked at the combination of these, and we're starting to think about deer populations, how do we keep populations and damage at a tolerable level? And this is the not so great part of the story, because it's hard, especially once you understand a little bit about deer population biology or ecology. And so that's what we're gonna spend a little bit of time on here. So first of all, deer don't grow at a constant rate. Okay. Population size typically, and let's say this is an unhunted population right here. If you just kind of let them go, they will grow slowly for the first couple of years, and then they grow very rapidly. The population grows very rapidly for a short time, and then deer will actually start responding to their habitat, and it's a relationship between the size of the deer herd and how much available food is out there or how much available cover is out there. And so in theory, they'll start slowing down as they approach that biological carrying capacity. I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard these terms before, but this is that response that deer will have. And basically what's happening is as they approach carrying capacity, they're basically the amount of fawns that make it into adulthood, which is at 6 months, starts to slow down. And this is for a variety of reasons. It could be because the doe doesn't have enough forage resources to feed her fawn. It could be because in areas where there's not very much cover. So like if we go back and look at this area right here, there's not very much cover. And so you might get a doe, maybe two, I don't know, depending on how large this is, who's using this one area, but they become very territorial, if you want to think of it that way, when they have their fawn, and they just don't let a bunch of does pile up in here and have fawns. And so you might have one here, here, and here, and then another one just has to have her fawn just like out here in the crop somewhere, or out here in maybe a fallow field or in somebody's backyard. And so the ones in here may be protected from predators, but the one out here who's in suboptimal habitat, it probably going to get eaten. And so all these things together starts helping level this off. Now, the problem becomes is when the amount of deer that we're going to tolerate, which is our social carrying capacity, when it actually goes past this. And so, at this point is when we start having a problem with deer, or the amount of damage that they're having. But that doesn't mean that they're overpopulated, because typically they're going to go to carrying capacity. If they go past carrying capacity, you're going to have some that'll die, that'll come back down below it. So this idea of carrying capacity is typically measured at the lowest time of the year. So, for us, it's typically going to be winter months, and there's maybe not enough food to support the deer that are out there. That's that upper limit for biological carrying capacity. In the spring, this right here actually would go up, but it was going to come back down quickly in the wintertime. Okay. And so you typically think about it at that lowest time. And so for a lot of places, it's going to be the amount of maybe food that's available in the wintertime that's going to limit this. In other places, like places throughout the Corn Belt, this could just be to the amount of cover that's available for fawning cover. And so going back to that example that we just looked at, if there's not enough cover for the fawns, again, more of them could be picked off by predators. And it's not that it's a predator issue. It's just there's not enough cover to provide that protection. And so different things will actually limit the growth of the deer population. But in theory, it should reach this equilibrium. But, in reality, it might go past this. It might drop down. If you have a harsh winter, this biological carrying capacity would actually drop down a little bit and come back up at another time of the year. So this is always kind of a dynamic fluctuation. Okay. The other thing to think about it is, different places around Indiana are going to have different carrying capacities. And again, we looked at how, even within a mile, you can have a very different deer population. And a lot of that's just really due to the carrying capacity of that land and those characteristics. And so the growth curve is going to be the same. It's just that you have fewer deer. Okay. So it just can't support as much. So again, thinking back to down to Harrison County and that closed in forest, it's going to have a lower carrying capacity, but the growth curve to that is going to be the same. It's going to have that same shape. The problem becomes is that carrying capacity is also, the social carrying capacity, the place where we tolerate, can actually be lower in here when there is a lower carrying capacity, because in this case, you might see more plants, understory plants getting damaged because there's less of them out there. And so again, if that's what we are interested in, and that's setting that social carrying capacity and that decision-making point at which we've got too many deer, then it can be lower or be at a smaller population size compared to, somewhere else in the state. So again, none of these things are consistent across the state. It's all depending upon where you're at. So how does hunting relate to this idea of carrying capacity and how many deer we have out there on the landscape? Well, basically, the way to start thinking about this is we're going to start adding some fluctuation in here. And so let's say that deer are approaching carrying capacity every year, okay? Because we've had deer in Indiana a while now, and so they're getting up there, they're getting close to it, unless we've got a place that has just lots and lots of deer harvest. But let's say if we were getting up there close every year, the annual harvest is going to drop it back down. And so from looking at our population numbers now, we can see that hunters are harvesting between 10 to 15%, maybe as high as 20% in some areas, maybe as high as 30% of the does in a given area. And typically you can harvest about 30 to 35% of the does and have that population bounce right back every year. Okay. And so what we're seeing is that annual harvest, and then population's coming kind of right back up there, the annual harvest, and it's coming right back up. Maybe it goes a little bit above it, 1 year. Maybe we have a few more deer that die because of lack of resources, but it's just kind of this stable fluctuation from year to year. Okay. And now again, you could have a small area that the harvest is more than this and it's going down a little bit, or it can be less than this and it's just, again, growing right back, to near carrying capacity. If you start thinking about, well, how can we actually drive down a deer population in an area? If that was, your goal, it takes a significant amount of harvest. Some of the studies on this have shown that you've got to get down to about 70% of a deer herd to push it down in a single year. Okay. Again, if you get above 40%, it'll start slowly bringing it down year after year. But in order to see like a quick response and then to keep it down, in a single year, you would have to harvest like 70%. And that's just not happening with recreational harvest. There's not that much demand for the deer to do that. So keeping all that in mind, okay, like I said, most of these problems with deer wind up being a local phenomenon. So again, somebody, or here's again is Brookville Lake. This is for the most part Franklin County, but you can see the amount of diversity from just across this single county. So approaches like just increasing the county limit aren't going to work, because you might get more harvest in this area where the vast majority of the deer are, but it still could be these people over here in the area with a low deer density who are having significant problems. So, thinking about this, you've really got to understand what's going on in that surrounding area to understand what you can do. Okay. And really it kind of takes these like localized solutions to address these problems. And so, again, the state increasing quotas and that kind of stuff. One, the increasing quotas, for the most part, hunters, they really desire 1 or 2 deer. Most hunters want 2 deer. They want a buck and a doe. Beyond that, it's fewer and fewer people who want that. And actually only so 70% of our successful hunters harvest 1 deer. 20% harvest 2 deer. About another 3 or 4% harvest 3 deer. And then that number starts going down from there. And so before hunters even get into our county deer bonus antlerless quotas, they can already harvest 3 deer. And so just with a bow and muzzleloader, and then with a rifle on top of that, they can harvest another deer. So that's already 4 before they even have to tap into those extra deer. And so this is why, I say it really requires kind of a local, you addressing this on a local scale, if this is, your desire, if you're trying to get your oak seedlings or small plants under your forest to be able to be released from that browsing pressure. So I hope that was helpful. Now, if you are interested in becoming more active in deer management, every year we do a survey and we take input from the public, and this is both hunters and non-hunters. And that's how we set these county quotas and harvest limits and make these decisions. And so if you are interested in participating, if you just send an email to deersurvey@dnr.in.gov and just include your name, we'll have your email address there already, and just let us know you're interested. And basically what we'll do is we'll put you on a list, and then every year that we send out these surveys, or if we're looking for specific input, we'll send you a survey so you can make sure that your interests are being represented. And we're going to try to get something even a little easier to go up online where you can just click on it and fill out a little bit of information. But for right now, until we get that done, I just wanted to make sure this group knew that if you want to have input, you can do that just by sending this email address, and this comes to me, just a note saying that you are interested in getting this information. Okay. And so again, if you've got any specific questions, here's my contact information. I'm always happy to talk with you and answer questions. So that's about all I've got for you. I'm gonna stop sharing here.
Thanks so much, Joe. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. And it's exciting to see how the DNR is using a variety of new techniques to look at some of this stuff instead of some of the older systems of hand counting them. It sounds like a rough plane ride. If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the box. I do see a couple, and I'll moderate those in a minute. But before I do, I'd like to make you all aware of a series of publications that are coming out in April called the Deer Impact Toolbox. These are produced by Purdue Extension, and I'm one of the co-authors on those publications. There are 4 publications in the series. One is called Introduction to Deer Impacts. A second is called Understanding Deer Impacts. A third is Monitoring Deer Impacts, and the fourth is Managing for Deer Impacts. They share information on how deer are impacting our landscape and how to tell how much, if any, your own property is being impacted. As Joe mentioned, not all properties are impacted alike, but it could be that you don't recognize or aren't aware that you're having pretty negative impacts on your own property. So there's helpful guidance on various measures you can take to limit the harm they cause to your trees or your native plants, and how to recognize what issues you're facing. When those publications are available, I will send an email to all of you and let you know that those have been released with links to those. Those are free downloads. And let's see what we have in the chat here. Susan asked, how is fragmentation defined?
We'd have to ask Zach that. I would assume it's basically the amount of just how it's broken up, on the landscape, but I can't tell you that exactly. I just don't know like the exact measure that he used for that, or like, I'm sure we could go back through the paper and look at it, but I'm assuming he had a specific amount of area that he was looking at, and then basically just possibly the like total amount of edge or something like that's around. But yeah, we would have to talk to Zach or go back and look at his paper to really understand like exactly which measure of fragmentation he used for that.
Okay. Is the IDNR collaborating with landowners on this, for example, using their trail cam data?
No. So the unique thing about when we collect this trail camera data is the cameras have to be put out in a random fashion. Okay. So you can't select where you're going to put them out. You have to like basically take a map and put random points on there. And then you have to use a technique called distance sampling. And this is incredibly critical for anytime we use trail camera data, is you have to know how far the deer is standing from the front of the camera, because deer at different distances will represent different numbers of deer on the landscape. And so, for instance, if you think about it, if a deer is standing very close to the camera, that might represent a different number than a deer that's standing further back. Okay, because the camera is kind of a cone shape. And so, because of those two reasons, we typically aren't using camera data that's put out by landowners. We did try this past fall, and we're still evaluating that. We were trying to estimate what we call recruitment rate, which is what I was talking about when I was showing you those growth curves. And that recruitment rate is the number of those fawns that make it into the adult population. And with that, theoretically, we can use trail cameras that landowners have put out, except you get into this problem of a lot of times they'll put them on like food so they can actually attract animals to their camera, and not putting them out in a random fashion. But we're trying to understand like what impact that's having. But when Zach was doing this work, most of his work was done on private land. And so he actually asked private landowners for can we set up these cameras on your land? And got a lot of participation that way. And so while we weren't using their cameras, we were using just access to their land, because of course we have to have permission to do that. And so anytime we are doing trail camera studies, we are collaborating with the public, but in that fashion, as opposed to collecting their data from them.
Thanks. Will the Purdue research efforts that the state is implementing continue over multiple years to provide temporal range in the data set?
Oh yeah, we're planning on doing this population estimate every year. And so we may not do the entire, we got to wait and see kind of how it plays out. And so we might not do the entire state every year. We might do, let's say, the northern half of the state one year and the southern half of the state another year. We're going to try to do our public lands every year, because again, they get that high harvest pressure. And so, but yeah, the idea is that this is going to be an ongoing effort that we will just, once we get it going, it's just going to be part of what we do, to estimate the deer population and go into our harvest setting programs. We can get a better idea of like how deer populations are actually responding to different harvest strategies, which we've never really been able to do very well before.
The DNR and Purdue are collecting data, but how is the DNR going to actually use the data and implement new regulations?
Looking at this, it's giving us, first of all, that population data is giving us an idea of what impact those regulations are having. Okay. And, a lot of our regulations are really, these social constructs. And so, for instance, we may get, let's say, pressure to increase the county quotas. Now, when we do that, we can actually see how the deer populations are responding. And, is that regulation, doing what we thought it was going to do? Or is it having a greater impact than we think it will? Because like I said, there are a few places in the state where hunters are actually harvesting really that maximum number. And so that's also informing our decision that, unless there is a desire to reduce the deer density in that area, we need to back off a little bit. And so, basically we're just looking and using this for how populations are responding. If we're seeing areas with really high deer density and greater demand from hunters, we can, increase harvest there to allow more harvest to occur. But without this density information, it's kind of hard to know how these respond without using various kind of indirect indices to figure out what's going on, which are much less precise than these methods.
Sounds like you're working a lot less blind than you used to be.
Yeah.
You mentioned signing up to get the surveys or be involved in the surveys. What are you trying to measure with the surveys, and what kind of questions are you asking?
Yeah, it's a variety of questions. So sometimes there are questions where, like, for instance, this about 2 years ago, we were interested in how many people were feeding deer. Okay, just to understand, like, the how prevalent it was across the land, uh, what they were feeding, how much they were feeding, a variety of things like that. Hunters typically get questions about potential regulation changes. So, for instance, when to start firearm season. A lot of hunters are interested in that, and they want to see it shifted back and forth a little bit. So, a lot of times we'll be asking hunters, uh, you know, when do you think this season should start? Because again, that's more of a question that really hunters are going to have an interest in, and most other people aren't. In general, we have a running set of questions that we ask every year. And it's basically things like, you know, what do you think of the deer population in your area? Do you think there are more deer or fewer deer than you've seen in the past 5 years? How do you feel about that population? What would you like us to do? Would you like us to increase quotas or decrease quotas? And so those types of questions we ask every year, so we get this running change. And so, for instance, if we had an area where we start seeing that more and more people are saying we need to increase the quotas or decrease the deer population, and then both of them are saying that, and then we're looking at our data and going, well, yeah, populations seem to be creeping up. That tells us that, hey, that's a good move to do that. And so those running questions, help with that, just to let us know what people think over time. And it's just that way of having public input into our deer management process. And this survey was actually demanded by hunters about 6 years ago. They wanted more direct input into deer management, and so what we did, we used to have surveys that went out to farming landowners and hunters, and it was like every 3 years we would survey each group. This is something we do every year, and it goes out to everybody. So anybody who has an interest in deer or managing land or anything like that, or even if they don't, they just want to participate because they want to exercise their, and have input into management, they can. And so, that's the purpose of it, is just to have input into, those various questions.
Is this data available to the public? This sounds like a lot like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service waterfowl studies. Their data is released to the public to help them understand where the population is at and what affects them.
Yeah, we're working on it. It's not available right now. I'm actually working with one of our GIS people to figure out, make it look right. What layers are we going to have on there in terms of maps and things like that. But that base underlying, population estimate, the idea is that will eventually be released on it's what we call our Where to Hunt app. And so that's a online platform that hunters typically go to see like where the public lands are and that kind of stuff. And this will just be another layer in that map that people can turn on and off that will show deer population density. And of course, right now it's only available for those three, like about a third of the state. So that northeastern area, the counties kind of over there around Lafayette, West Lafayette, and then down in the center of the state in our more wooded areas. But Purdue is actually doing flights right now. I hope they're getting ready to go out. But they're flying across the state, collecting more data. And then as that is processed and put into the models, then that we're trying to fix it where we can just update that map and upload it right in there. But yeah, the idea is to have this publicly available for folks to use it. It's just a matter of, getting it out there and getting it available. The survey data and things like that are also publicly available. So, you can go and look by county and look and see like what the overall responses are and what people are saying, and like, how opinions have changed over time. And you can look at things like deer vehicle collisions, like how those have changed over time, how harvest rates have changed over time. So pretty much all of our data is we put out in various dashboards so folks can go and look at these things by county and then by all these different factors that we collect with our social data and so forth.
We have one more question and then we'll wrap it up after that. Wait a minute. I lost my question. Are there any plans to educate the public on how much harvest is needed to maintain, grow, or reduce the deer herd? We felt good with our numbers and my family harvested 5 does on our 200 acres. However, that was just a guess. I'm glad to see this 30 to 35% to help my own management. Also, is there a way to further connect hunters to programs that feed the hungry to encourage additional harvest?
Yeah, so the last part of your question, I think there are some folks actually working on that and trying to get that information out there. To the first part of your question, yes. So one, this presentation, with some of these charts about how the population responds to hunting and things like that. Hopefully that will be out there. And basically the more that we learn about our population size, the more we can like look at these individual counties and start thinking about that. But I mean, yes, over time, we want to try to develop more materials that if folks are interested, they can get out there and look at it. A lot of times it comes down to how much hunters are demanding. If you think of in terms of supply and demand, there are, for the most part, plenty of deer out there to support that demand. But in areas where, maybe people are experiencing damage, it's like, how do you get more people using that area if you want the population to come down a little bit and maybe have, more forest plants and things like that. And that's the tricky part, because like I said, we ask hunters, and this is one of the things we ask hunters in the survey, is how many deer did you want? And how many deer did you harvest? And a lot of times what we're seeing is, hunters not getting quite what they wanted, but what they're typically wanting are about 2 deer. Okay. So, so if you start thinking about that and you're thinking, well, let's try to get maybe some hunters coming to my land, plan on the fact that they're only going to want 1 or 2 deer. So you might want more people over time rather than 1 or 2 hunters who are only going to take 1 or 2 deer.
Makes sense. And I also might mention that monitoring publication will give people an opportunity to go out on their own property and try some methods to see what kind of impacts they're having, and they can make decisions based on those impacts. Well, I want to thank you again, Joe, for meeting with us today and telling us about all this great work that you're doing at the DNR. And we appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's a beautiful evening, and we appreciate you sitting at your computer with us. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested in forestry or woodland owner, we have information for upcoming events on our IFA website. I'll send you a follow-up email with some of the resources that Joe shared, and notify you when this recording is available for viewing. We appreciate your time, and thanks, and have a good evening.